The transport shuttle descended toward Nexus Prime, and Jiwon pressed her face against the viewport like a child visiting a museum for the first time. The station stretched across the darkness of space, a massive ring of gleaming metal and transparent domes that held the largest collection of linguistic knowledge in the known galaxy. She had dreamed of this place for years, ever since humanity had been accepted into the Galactic Linguistic Consortium 2 decades ago. Beside her, Borum was reading through a datapad, her lips moving silently as she reviewed ancient scripts. They had both been selected for the Cultural Exchange Program, an honor that only a handful of human linguists received each year. Jiwon felt the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders as the docking clamps engaged with a gentle thump. The interior of Nexus Prime was breathtaking. Vast corridors lined with sealed chambers stretched in every direction, each one containing artifacts and records from civilizations across the galaxy. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of environmental systems, and holographic displays floated at every intersection, showing samples of alien scripts that shifted and morphed in mesmerizing patterns. Their guide was waiting at the arrival terminal. Velthar stood nearly 3 meters tall, his forearms folded in what Jiwon had learned was a gesture of formal greeting among his people. His compound eyes reflected the corridor lights in fractal patterns, and his skin had the pale blue tint of the Crithian species. He wore the deep purple robes of a master linguist, marked with 17 badges of academic achievement. "Welcome to the Grand Linguistic Repository," Velthar said, his voice translated through the small device clipped to Jiwon's collar. "I am honored to guide you through our collection, though I must confess some surprise at humanity's interest in our work." Jiwon felt the subtle condescension in his tone but kept her expression neutral. She had been warned about this. Humans were newcomers to the galactic community, barely a century into their space age. Many of the older species viewed them as enthusiastic children, well-meaning but lacking the depth of culture that came with millennia of civilization. "We're grateful for the opportunity," Jiwon replied, bowing slightly. "Earth has much to learn from the consortium." Velthar's mandibles clicked in what might have been approval. He gestured with 2 of his arms, and they began walking through the corridors. "Your species presents an interesting case," he said as they walked. "Most spacefaring civilizations develop a unified culture before reaching the stars. Humanity remained fragmented, with thousands of distinct linguistic groups existing simultaneously on a single world. It is quite unusual." Borum exchanged a glance with Jiwon but said nothing. They had heard variations of this observation many times before. To the galaxy, Earth's diversity was an anthropological curiosity, evidence of a delayed social evolution rather than a strength. They entered a vast chamber that took Jiwon's breath away. The ceiling arched high above them, supported by pillars that seemed to be made of crystallized light. Display cases lined the walls in ascending tiers, each one containing manuscripts, tablets, or data crystals from extinct civilizations. Holographic labels floated beside each display, showing sample texts and linguistic analyses. "This section houses the Earth languages," Velthar said, sweeping 2 arms in a grand gesture. "Your world has contributed more extinct languages to our archive than any other single planet. Over 6,000 documented linguistic systems that died before your species achieved spaceflight. It is a remarkable testament to cultural mortality." Jiwon walked along the displays, seeing familiar names rendered in galactic standard script: Ancient Egyptian, Classical Mayan, Old Norse, Akkadian, each one carefully preserved behind energy fields, each one declared dead by alien scholars who had never walked on Earth's soil. "We have spent considerable resources reconstructing these languages," Velthar continued, warming to his subject. His academic pride was evident in the way his arms gestured expressively. Particularly challenging were those with no living descendants. Sumerian, for example, required decades of analysis. "I personally led the team that developed the definitive phonetic reconstruction." They stopped before a large display case containing several clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped marks. The label read Sumerian cuneiform, extinct circa 100 CE, Earth Standard. Jiwon felt something twist in her chest as she read those words. Extinct. As if the language had been a species that breathed its last breath 2,000 years ago. Velthar activated a holographic display and symbols appeared in the air between them. "Allow me to demonstrate," he said, his voice taking on the tone of a professor addressing students. This phrase is a common greeting from the Sumerian city-states. Based on our analysis of linguistic drift patterns from related Semitic languages in comparison with early Akkadian borrowings, we have determined the pronunciation with 93% confidence. He began to speak, producing sounds that were clearly alien to his physiology. His translation device amplified and modified his voice, creating what was presumably meant to be ancient Sumerian. Ji-won listened, her expression carefully neutral, but she felt Borum stiffen beside her. The pronunciation was wrong. Not slightly off, but fundamentally incorrect in ways that showed a deep misunderstanding of how the language actually worked. The vowel sounds were too regular, the consonant clusters impossible for human mouths of that era to produce comfortably. The tonal emphasis suggested a language trying to sound ancient and important, rather than one used by living people to buy bread and complain about taxes. Velthar finished his recitation with evident satisfaction. Several other alien scholars had gathered to watch, their various appendages making gestures of approval. This was clearly a moment of pride for the consortium, a demonstration of their linguistic prowess. Ji-won cleared her throat softly. "That was very interesting," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But I think there might be a small error in the reconstruction." Velthar's compound eyes focused on her, and the chamber grew quiet. "An error?" he repeated, his tone suggesting polite skepticism. "Young scholar, I assure you this reconstruction represents the consensus of the finest xenolinguistic minds in the galaxy. Perhaps you misunderstood the complexity of the verb conjugation is wrong," Ji-won said, her voice gentle but firm. "And the vowel in the second word should be shorter, more like A than A. Also, you're treating it as if it were an isolated language. But Sumerian was in constant contact with Akkadian speakers. There would have been borrowings, code switching. Real people spoke this in real cities. It wouldn't have sounded so formal." The silence in the chamber deepened. Velthar's forearms had gone completely still, a sign of shock in his species. "How could you possibly know this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ji-won stepped closer to the display, her eyes scanning the ancient tablets with obvious familiarity. "Because Sumerian didn't go extinct," she said simply. "It stopped being a mother tongue, yes, but scholars on Earth never stopped studying it. We have continuity of knowledge going back centuries. I studied it for 3 years at university. Would you like me to show you the correct pronunciation?" Borum was grinning now, no longer trying to hide her amusement. Around them, alien scholars began pressing closer, their translation devices buzzing with confused chatter. Velthar looked from Ji-won to the tablets and back again, his academic certainty crumbling like those ancient clay documents would if exposed to air. "Please," he said finally, gesturing toward the display with one trembling arm. "Demonstrate." Ji-won took a breath and began to read from the tablet, her voice clear and confident. The words flowed from her mouth like water over smooth stones, each syllable placed with care but without the artificial stiffness that Velthar had demonstrated. The sounds were human, comfortable for a human throat and tongue to produce, yet carrying the weight of 4,000 years of history. The alien scholars stood frozen, their various sensory organs fixed on this young human woman who was speaking a language their databases had declared dead for 2 millennia. The holographic display flickered as if uncertain how to process what it was hearing, its algorithm struggling to match the sounds against the reconstruction they had stored. When Ji-won finished, she turned to face Velthar. "The grammatical structure you used suggests a highly inflected language with strict word order, but Sumerian was actually agglutinative with relatively free word order in poetry. The verb chains could be quite complex, and the way subjects and objects were marked changed depending on whether you were writing administrative documents or literary texts." Velthar's mandibles worked silently. His forearms had begun making small, jerky movements that suggested his species' equivalent of nervous agitation. "This is not possible," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The language died out as a spoken tongue in the 2nd millennium BCE. By your common era, it existed only in fossil form, in texts that later civilizations could not read. How could knowledge of proper pronunciation survive such a gap?" "It didn't survive perfectly," Ji-won admitted, her tone respectful, "but it didn't completely disappear either. Akkadian scholars kept studying Sumerian texts for centuries after it stopped being spoken. They left us grammatical notes, bilingual dictionaries, even pronunciation guides. Then Arab scholars preserved those texts, Renaissance humanists studied them. By the time modern archaeology developed, we had an unbroken chain of scholarship, however thin, connecting us back to the original language. Borum stepped forward, moving toward another display case. It's the same with most of our so-called extinct languages, she said, stopping before a case marked Latin extinct circa 600 CE. She smiled at the label like it was an old joke. Latin never died. It changed, evolved into French and Spanish and Italian, yes. But scholars kept reading it, writing it, speaking it in universities and churches. The Pope still gives addresses in Latin. Medical students learn it. Lawyers use it. It's been in continuous use for over 2,000 years. She activated the holographic display, which showed a passage from Virgil's Aeneid. Then, without warning, she began to recite from memory. Her pronunciation was clear and precise, the vowels rounded in the classical style, the rhythm of the hexameter verse carrying through even without the original music that would have accompanied it. The alien who had been studying the Latin display, a crystalline being whose name G1 didn't know, made a sound like wind chimes in a storm. The prosody, it said through its translator. The metrical feat. Our reconstruction was completely wrong. We treated it like prose, didn't understand it was meant to be sung. Most poetry is meant to be heard, not just read, Borum said gently. Latin was a living language used by living people. They didn't speak in inscriptions. They joked, they swore, they wrote love letters and shopping lists. When you reconstruct a language from formal texts alone, you miss all of that. A commotion at the far end of the chamber drew everyone's attention. Minho, another member of the human delegation, had been quietly exploring on his own. Now he stood before a case marked Sanskrit extinct circa 1300 CE, and he was laughing softly. Extinct? He called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. Someone should tell the priests in Varanasi. They've been chanting in Sanskrit every day for the last 3,000 years. They'd be surprised to learn they're speaking a dead language. He bowed toward the display with obvious reverence, then began to chant. The sounds were complex, full of aspirated consonants and subtle vowel distinctions that the alien audio equipment struggled to capture. But more than the technical accuracy, there was a quality to his recitation that made it clear this was not a reconstruction or a guess. This was knowledge passed down through generations, preserved in ritual and practice and living memory. Velthar had backed away from the displays, all four arms wrapped around himself in a gesture of deep distress. How many? He asked, his voice barely audible. How many of the languages we declared extinct are still known to your people? Jiwan exchanged glances with Borum and Minho. Most of them, she said carefully. At least the ones from the last 3,000 years or so. Ancient Greek, Aramaic, Old Church Slavonic, Classical Chinese, Classical Arabic, Old English, Middle Persian, Coptic. Some are only known to specialists. Some are still used in religious contexts. Some are taught in schools. But they didn't disappear. We didn't let them. A small alien with 8 legs and iridescent fur approached timidly. But why? It asked, its translator giving its voice a musical quality. Once a language stops being a mother tongue, once it no longer serves a practical purpose, why expend resources to maintain it? Our people had 17 languages in our pre-industrial era. Now we have one, and we are more unified for it. The old languages exist in our databases, perfectly preserved. Why would you need more than that? Minho answered, his expression thoughtful. Because a database isn't enough. A recording isn't enough. Languages aren't just communication tools. They're ways of thinking, ways of seeing the world. Each one carries concepts and ideas that don't quite translate into any other tongue. When you lose a language, you lose all of that. So we keep them alive even in limited form because we refuse to accept that kind of loss. But the effort, the small alien pressed, the years of study required, the resources devoted to maintaining knowledge that has no practical application in your modern society. Is it efficient? Efficiency isn't everything, Borum said, her voice firm but not unkind. Humans are not always practical. We're sentimental. We're stubborn. We hold on to things long past the point where logic says we should let them go. Our planet has seen thousands of cultures rise and fall, and each time something died, we tried to preserve some piece of it. Maybe that makes us inefficient, but it also means we have living connections to our past that go back thousands of years. Velthar had been silent, his compound eyes fixed on the 3 humans. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of realization that made the other aliens grow quiet. "We have made a terrible mistake," he said. "Not just with the human languages, but with our entire approach to linguistic extinction. We assume that when a language stops being spoken as a mother tongue, it is dead. We approach these languages as archaeologists approach fossils, as historians approach ruins. We never imagined that the speakers might not have let go." He moved toward Jiwan, his posture shifting into one that she recognized as supplication among his people. "How many of our reconstructions are wrong?" he asked. "How much of our life's work is built on false assumptions?" Jiwan felt sympathy for him despite his earlier condescension. "I don't know," she said honestly. "We can work together to find out. Correct the records, build new ones. That's why we're here, isn't it? To share knowledge." Around them, more alien scholars were gathering, drawn by news of what was happening. Display cases that had stood unchanged for decades suddenly seemed uncertain, their labels questionable. The Grand Linguistic Repository, which had seemed so permanent and authoritative when Jiwan arrived, now felt like something more fragile. A palace built on sand, beautiful but unstable, waiting for the tide of new information to reshape its foundations. Velthar straightened, his academic pride warring with his intellectual honesty. "We must convene the consortium," he said finally. "This is larger than my embarrassment or the reputation of this archive. If human knowledge of these supposedly extinct languages is accurate, then our entire theoretical framework for linguistic extinction must be revised. And if we are wrong about human languages, we may be wrong about others as well." He looked at Jiwan with something that might have been respect. "You have given us a gift today," he said quietly, "though I suspect it will be a painful one to receive." The emergency session of the Galactic Linguistic Consortium was called for 3 days after what the alien scholars had begun, calling the Sumerian incident. Word had spread through the academic networks with remarkable speed, carrying with it a mixture of excitement, skepticism, and in some cases outright panic. Over 200 xenolinguists had built their careers on studying dead Earth languages. If humans had maintained knowledge of these supposedly extinct tongues, decades or even centuries of scholarship might need to be completely revised. The council chamber was a circular space designed to accommodate the diverse physiologies of the galaxy's sentient species. Seats and platforms were arranged in concentric rings around a central speaking area, with environmental controls adjusted for each section. The air shimmered slightly where different atmospheric preferences met and mixed. Jiwan sat with the other human delegates in the outer ring, feeling very small and very young as the chamber filled with some of the most respected academics in known space. Hana, the human ambassador to the consortium, sat beside her. She was older than Jiwan by 20 years, her hair streaked with gray, her face carrying the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating galactic politics. She leaned close to Jiwan and whispered, "Whatever happens in here, stay calm. Some of these scholars have spent their entire lives on work that we're about to tell them is wrong. They won't react well." The session was called to order by the consortium chair, a being whose species Jiwan had never encountered before. It looked like a collection of floating geometric shapes that constantly rearranged themselves, communicating through pulses of colored light that the translation system converted to speech. "We are here to address claims made by the human delegation regarding the status of certain Earth languages currently classified as extinct in our databases. Linguist Velthar has requested this emergency session. Velthar, please present your findings." Velthar moved to the central speaking area, his forearms gesturing in patterns that conveyed academic distress. 3 days ago, I was corrected in my pronunciation of ancient Sumerian by a human scholar. I had assumed this was an error on her part, a misunderstanding born of enthusiasm rather than knowledge. I was wrong. The human not only demonstrated superior knowledge of Sumerian phonetics and grammar, but also explained how that knowledge has been maintained on Earth through continuous scholarly tradition. He paused, his mandibles clicking softly. This revelation led me to investigate further. I have discovered that a significant number of Earth languages we classify as extinct are, in fact, still known to human scholars. Some are taught in their educational institutions. Some are used in religious contexts. Some exist as the subjects of ongoing academic study, but they have not disappeared in the way we assumed. A ripple of movement went through the assembled scholars. An insectoid being in the second ring stood abruptly, its wings buzzing in agitation. Jiwan recognized it as Threx, one of the consortium's most celebrated members. His work on ancient Egyptian had been required reading in her graduate program. "This is absurd," Thorex announced, his translator giving his words a sharp, clipping quality. "I have spent 140 years studying ancient Egyptian. I have analyzed every available text, cross-referenced with related languages, employed the most sophisticated computational models. My reconstruction is considered definitive. Are we to believe that these newcomers, these humans who have barely left their own solar system, have superior knowledge?" Hannah rose smoothly from her seat, her movement drawing attention. "May I speak?" she asked, and the chair pulsed agreement. She descended to the central speaking area, her posture relaxed but her voice carrying clearly. "Thorex, I mean no disrespect to your work or your years of scholarship. But yes, in this particular case, humans do have superior knowledge. Not because we are smarter or more advanced, but simply because these are our languages. They come from our world, spoken by our ancestors, and we never completely let them go." Threx's wings buzzed louder. "Ancient Egyptian stopped being a spoken language in the 5th century by your calendar. How could pronunciation possibly survive across 1,700 years of silence?" "It didn't survive perfectly," Hannah admitted, "but it didn't disappear either." Coptic Christians maintained a liturgical tradition that descended from late Egyptian. Arab scholars studied hieroglyphics. European archaeologists decoded the Rosetta Stone and established scholarly traditions. Each generation taught the next, built on previous knowledge, corrected previous errors. By the time we reached the space age, we had a reasonably accurate understanding of how ancient Egyptian sounded and worked. She gestured, and a holographic display appeared in the center of the chamber. It showed a timeline of human linguistic scholarship, branching and interconnecting like the root system of a vast tree. "This is how humans approach extinct languages. We don't treat them as isolated phenomena to be reconstructed from first principles. We trace them through history, follow their influences and descendants, maintain continuous chains of scholarship even across centuries of political upheaval and social change." Yuna, the graduate student, stood and asked permission to speak. When granted, she made her way to the central area with obvious nervousness. She was younger than Jiwon, barely past her 20th year, but her voice was steady as she addressed the assembled scholars. "I specialize in endangered languages," Yuna said. "On Earth, we have about 7,000 languages currently spoken. About half of them are endangered, meaning they have fewer speakers with each generation. We know what language death looks like because we're watching it happen in real time, but we're also fighting it, trying to preserve and revive languages even as they fade. This gives us a different perspective than species who experienced rapid linguistic unification." She activated her own display, showing a list of Earth languages. "I can speak, read, or at least demonstrate basic competency in 15 languages that your databases classify as extinct. Ancient Greek, which I studied for 6 years and can use to read Homer in the original. Old Norse, which I learned because I'm fascinated by Viking literature. Classical Chinese, which I studied to read Confucian texts. Aramaic, which is still used by some Christian communities. Coptic, maintained by the Coptic Church. Old English, required for my medieval literature courses." She continued through the list, and with each language, she provided a brief sample. The chamber filled with sounds that the alien scholars had thought lost forever. Some of her pronunciations were uncertain, marked as reconstructions even by human standards, but others flowed with the confidence of knowledge passed down through generations of teachers and students. The chair pulsed for attention. "This is remarkable, but I must ask the obvious question. If these languages are not truly extinct, why did humans not correct our databases when you joined the consortium 20 years ago?" Hannah smiled slightly. "Because we didn't realize you thought they were extinct," she said. "When we saw them in your archives, we assumed you were maintaining them as cultural records the way we maintain records of living languages. It never occurred to us that you had declared them dead. The word extinct in Galactic Standard doesn't have quite the same emotional weight as it does in human languages. We thought you were being scholarly and formal, not literal." A small alien with tentacles for limbs spoke up from the 4th ring. "But surely you must see how this appears from our perspective. Every spacefaring species we have encountered experienced a period of linguistic consolidation before reaching the stars. Having 1 or perhaps 2 languages is the norm. Humanity's 7,000 languages seemed like evidence of delayed development. And your extinct languages seemed to prove that you were finally following the expected pattern, just very slowly and with extensive documentation. Which is exactly the kind of assumption that causes problems, Minho said, standing in his section. You assumed our diversity was a weakness or a developmental stage. You assumed that linguistic death on Earth followed the same patterns you experienced. You assumed that our relationship with our past was the same as yours. But humans are different. We hold on to things. We remember. Even when it's impractical, even when it's difficult, we refuse to let go of our history. Threx made a sound like grinding metal. This is emotional reasoning, not scientific method. Languages are tools for communication. When they cease to serve that function, they become objects of historical study, nothing more. To claim otherwise is to let sentiment cloud academic judgment. Maybe, Jiwan said quietly, surprising herself by speaking up. But sentiment has kept these languages alive for centuries. Scientific reconstruction is valuable, but it's not the same as living knowledge. A language isn't just vocabulary and grammar rules. It's rhythm and emphasis and the way certain words feel in your mouth. It's cultural context and historical layers and all the little things that get lost when you treat it as a purely intellectual exercise. The chamber erupted in a dozen conversations at once. Aliens arguing with each other in their native tongues. Translation systems struggling to keep up. The chair pulsed repeatedly for order, its geometric shape spinning faster with what might have been frustration. Finally, Velthar raised all four arms in a gesture that commanded attention. Colleagues, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. Our pride is wounded. I understand this because mine is as well. But we must face the truth. Our reconstructions of human languages were built on assumptions that have proven false. The question now is not whether we were wrong, but what we do about it. Do we cling to our errors or do we have the courage to learn? The decision to undertake what became known as the Great Revision was not made easily or quickly. 3 weeks of debate followed the emergency session, with factions forming among the xenolinguistic community. Some, led by Velthar, embraced the opportunity to correct the historical record and learn from human approaches to language preservation. Others, particularly those whose careers were most deeply invested in the old reconstructions, resisted with increasing desperation. Jiwan found herself at the center of this academic storm, along with the other human linguists. They were invited to present papers, give demonstrations, and explain human linguistic methodology to audiences that ranged from genuinely curious to openly hostile. She learned to navigate questions that were really accusations, to respond to skepticism that bordered on insult, to remain patient when senior scholars twice her age dismissed her expertise. The breakthrough came not from the Earth languages themselves, but from an unexpected source. A delegation from the Veltari species requested a private meeting with the human team, and what they revealed changed everything. Deun, a specialist in pronunciation and phonetics, led the human delegation to the meeting. She was older than most of the team, her expertise earned through 40 years of studying how living and dead languages actually sounded versus how scholars thought they sounded. When the Veltari entered the conference room, moving with the fluid grace of their aquatic origins, she greeted them with the patience of someone who had seen this conversation coming. The Veltari spokesperson, her name rendered in human speech as something like wave pattern, settled into a water-filled chair before speaking. We have been following the debates with great interest, she said through her translator. 3 generations ago, our people experienced a plague that killed 70% of our population, including most of our elders. Our ancestral language died with them. The consortium helped us reconstruct it from recordings and texts, and we have been teaching it to our young as a way of reconnecting with our culture. She paused, and Jiwan saw something like pain ripple across her bioluminescent skin patterns. But it feels wrong. When we speak this language, it sounds mechanical, lifeless. We thought this was simply how old languages felt, like wearing clothing that doesn't quite fit. But now we wonder if the reconstruction itself is flawed. Deun leaned forward, her expression intent. Tell me about the recordings you provided to the consortium. Were they formal speeches? Religious ceremonies? What context? Mostly formal context, Wave Pattern admitted. State broadcasts, academic lectures, ceremonial occasions. Those were what survived in our archives. Casual conversation, family recordings, everyday speech. All of that was lost in the chaos of the plague. There's your problem, Deun said gently. Formal speech and casual speech are often very different, sometimes dramatically so. If the reconstruction was based only on formal recordings, then yes, it would sound stiff and unnatural. Real languages are messy, flexible, full of variations and shortcuts that formal speech irons out. Kyung, the historian who specialized in language revival movements, added his perspective. On Earth, we've had both successes and failures at reviving languages. The successful revivals had certain things in common. They didn't just teach vocabulary and grammar. They recreated communities of speakers. They understood that languages live in people, not in textbooks. The meeting lasted for hours, and by the end, the Veltari had made a formal request. They wanted human linguists to come to their homeworld and help them truly revive their ancestral tongue, using methods that went beyond pure academic reconstruction. They wanted to learn how humans had kept languages alive across centuries of change and upheaval. When word of this request reached the consortium, the political landscape shifted dramatically. Other species began coming forward with similar stories, languages they had lost and tried to reconstruct, only to find the reconstructions felt hollow and false. The human approach, combining academic rigor with cultural continuity and community engagement, suddenly looked less like sentimental attachment and more like practical wisdom. Threx remained the loudest voice of opposition, but his position was weakening. In a public forum that drew scholars from across the station, he made his final stand against what he called the corruption of pure linguistic science with emotional reasoning. "We are scholars, not poets," he declared, his wings spread wide in a display of conviction. "Our task is to reconstruct languages as they were, based on evidence and rigorous analysis. The human approach introduces subjective elements, cultural biases, unverifiable assumptions about how languages feel or sound natural. This is not science." Salmon, an expert in language pedagogy who had arrived with the second wave of human specialists, rose to respond. She was small and soft-spoken, and several aliens made the mistake of thinking this meant she would be easy to dismiss. They were wrong. "You're right that we introduce subjective elements," Sumin said calmly. "Because languages are subjective. They're created by living beings, used by communities, shaped by culture and context and 1,000 unwritten rules that native speakers follow without thinking. When you strip all of that away and try to reconstruct a language as a pure system of rules, you create something that may be accurate on paper but dead in practice." She activated a holographic display showing 2 versions of ancient Greek text being read aloud. The first was a consortium reconstruction, precise and regular, every rule followed perfectly. The second was a recording of a human scholar reading the same text, with all the little variations and emphases that came from understanding the text, not just as words, but as literature. "Which one sounds like it was spoken by a real person?" Salman asked. "Which one sounds like it was meant to be heard by real ears, to convey emotion and meaning and beauty?" "Your reconstruction is technically correct, but ours is true." The silence that followed was profound. Threx's wings slowly folded, his posture shifting into something that might have been defeat or might have been revelation. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its harsh edge. "I have spent 140 years studying ancient Egyptian," he said quietly. "I learned every rule, analyzed every text, built models that predicted linguistic patterns with 97% accuracy. But I never once asked myself how it would have felt to actually speak the language, to live in it, to think in it. I treated it as a mathematical puzzle to be solved, not as something that was once alive." He turned to face Hana directly. "I was wrong," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "Not just about the specific reconstructions, but about what it means for a language to be extinct. I declared Egyptian dead because no one spoke it as a mother tongue anymore. But you humans understand something I did not. A language can exist in a twilight state, neither fully alive nor completely dead, maintained by the care and attention of those who refuse to let it disappear entirely." The Great Revision officially began the following week. Over 1,000 xenolinguists volunteered to work with human specialists, re-examining reconstructions not just of Earth languages but of extinct languages from across the galaxy. The work was painstaking and often humbling. Scholars who had published definitive grammars found themselves revising fundamental assumptions. Pronunciation guides were completely rewritten. Teaching materials were discarded and rebuilt from scratch. Ji-won worked alongside Velthar on the Sumerian materials, and she watched him transform from a proud academic defending his life's work into something more complex and interesting. A scholar willing to admit error and learn from it. They would spend hours debating fine points of pronunciation, examining how trade languages influenced formal speech, considering how writing systems shaped but didn't perfectly represent spoken words. "This is much harder than my original reconstruction," Velthar admitted one day, his forearms gesturing in frustration at a particularly difficult text. "When I could simply apply rules and models, everything was clear and systematic. But now, trying to understand how real people would have actually used these words, considering all the variation in context and unwritten knowledge, it's like trying to see in 3 dimensions when you've only known 2. That's because you're dealing with reality now instead of theory," Jiwan said, not unkindly. "Real languages are messy, but that messiness is what made them functional, what allowed them to carry not just information but culture and identity and all the things that make communication human." "Not just human," Velthar corrected gently. "The Veltari language is not human, yet it too was alive once, messy and flexible and real. What you humans have taught us is not that your way is correct, but that our way was incomplete. We treated linguistic extinction as binary, alive or dead, with nothing in between. You showed us the twilight states, the ways knowledge can persist even when living use does not." Outside the archive windows, Nexus Prime continued its eternal orbit, home to the galaxy's greatest collection of linguistic knowledge. But that knowledge was changing, evolving, being rebuilt on new foundations. The work would take years, perhaps decades. But for the first time in the consortium's history, the scholars were approaching dead languages not as fossils to be reconstructed, but as living things that might, with care and effort and understanding, be coaxed back from the edge of oblivion. The transport ship carrying Jiwan, Boram, Soman, and Junho approached the Veltari homeworld, through clouds that shimmered with colors human eyes had never been meant to see. Below them, cities rose from shallow seas, their architecture flowing and organic, built by and for a people who were equally comfortable in water and air. This was where the real test would begin, where theory would meet practice, where the human approach to language revival would either prove its worth or reveal itself as nothing more than optimistic philosophy. Wave Pattern met them at the landing platform, her skin patterns pulsing with what their translators interpreted as anxious hope. "Thank you for coming," she said, her aquatic voice carrying harmonics that made Jiwan think of whale songs. "Our young people are gathered in the Learning Center. They have been studying the reconstructed language for 2 years now, but they say it feels like wearing a costume, like pretending to be their ancestors rather than truly connecting with them." The Learning Center was a vast space half filled with water, allowing the Veltari to move between their 2 natural environments as they pleased. About 40 young Veltari were gathered, their age difficult for Jiwan to judge, but their skepticism universal across species. They had the look of students who had been told this would be important, but doubted anything would really change. Salman stepped forward first. She had prepared for this moment, studying the consortium's reconstruction materials and the original recordings that the Veltari had provided. Now she stood before these young aliens and spoke to them not as a scholar, but as a teacher who had seen this problem before. "Your language is broken," she said bluntly, and the translator caught gasps from the assembled students. "Not because your ancestors spoke poorly, but because the people who tried to bring it back didn't understand how languages actually live. They took formal speech and tried to make it casual. They took written rules and tried to make them sound natural. They did their best with what they knew, but their best wasn't good enough." One of the students, a young Veltari with unusually bright bioluminescence, spoke up. "If the experts got it wrong, how can you get it right? You've never even heard our language spoken naturally. Everyone who knew it that way is dead." "True," Junho said, moving to stand beside Soman. "But we've done something similar on Earth many times. We've taken languages that were barely alive and helped them recover. We've taken languages that existed only in old recordings and teaching materials and made them functional again. We can't promise to recreate your ancestral language exactly as it was, but we can help you create something real, something that lives in your mouths and minds, not just in textbooks." The work began slowly. Soman and Junho started by having the students stop using the reconstructed language entirely for a week. Instead, they studied the original recordings with fresh ears, listening not for words and grammar, but for rhythm, emotion, the little variations that showed personality and context. They learned to hear the difference between a speaker who was tired and one who was excited, between formal address and casual conversation, between someone speaking to an equal and someone speaking to an elder. Bahram worked with a group of Veltari elders who had been children when the plague struck. They didn't remember enough to speak the language, but they remembered fragments. A lullaby their parent had sung, a phrase their grandparent used when cooking, the way certain words sounded when spoken in anger or joy or sorrow. These fragments were precious, authentic pieces of the living language that no formal recording could capture. This phrase, one elder said, his skin patterns dim with age and memory. My grandmother used to say this when she was happy about something small. The way you've been teaching it, it sounds too formal, too important. It was a little word, a casual thing. It should sound like. He made a sound, struggling to remember, and Bahram recorded it carefully. Then she worked with him for hours, teasing out the exact melody of that phrase, the way it sat in the mouth, the emotion it carried. One phrase taking hours to properly understand, but worth it because it was real. Jiwan's role was different. She studied the written materials, comparing them to the recordings, looking for places where the two diverged. Written language and spoken language were never quite the same, and understanding those differences revealed much about how the language actually functioned. She found contractions that hadn't made it into the formal reconstruction. She found slang that had been dismissed as corruptions. She found the messy, vibrant reality of a language that had been alive before the consortium tried to turn it into a museum piece. After 3 weeks of this preparation, Soman made a decision that shocked the Veltari educators. Stop teaching the children grammar rules, she said. Start teaching them phrases, whole expressions, the way you'd teach someone to swim. You don't start with lectures on fluid dynamics. You put them in the water and guide them. The method was radical by consortium standards, but normal by human ones. The students learned chunks of language in context, corrected not by rules but by what sounded natural, encouraged to make mistakes and self-correct based on feel rather than regulation. It was chaotic and frustrating, and sometimes felt like no progress was being made at all. Then in the 5th week, something changed. 2 students were practicing a dialogue, one playing an elder and one playing a young person asking for advice. They stumbled over the formal phrases they'd been taught, stopped, looked at each other, and then one of them said something that wasn't in the teaching materials at all. It was a combination of words from the old recordings and structures from their native language, a hybrid that by all academic standards should have been wrong. But it sounded right. It sounded real. The other student responded, not with a scripted reply, but with something spontaneous, and suddenly they were having a conversation. Not perfect, not historically accurate, but alive in a way the reconstructed language had never been. Jiwan felt tears in her eyes as she watched. This was what revival looked like. Not a perfect recreation of something dead, but a new growth from old roots, shaped by the past but living in the present. The news spread quickly through the academic networks. The Veltari language revival was working, not in the sense of perfectly recreating what was lost, but in creating something that served the same function, connecting the young to their heritage, giving them a language that felt like it belonged to them rather than like a museum exhibit they were forced to wear. Other species began requesting human assistance with their own linguistic revivals. The consortium, after months of debate, officially adopted many human methodologies into their standard practices. More importantly, they revised their entire approach to linguistic extinction, acknowledging that the line between alive and dead was far less clear than they had believed. The final session of the Emergency Council, held 6 months after the initial revelation, felt more like a celebration than a crisis meeting. Velthar presented the results of the revised reconstructions, acknowledging both the progress made and the humility learned. Threx, standing beside him, added his own reflections on the nature of academic certainty and the courage required to admit fundamental error. Then the chair pulsed for attention and made an announcement that brought the chamber to stunned silence. The consortium has voted to establish a new division of our organization, to be called the Living Archive. Its purpose will be not merely to preserve extinct languages, but to actively work toward reviving endangered ones across the galaxy. The human delegation has been invited to direct this new division, with full collaboration from xenolinguistic specialists of all species. Hana stood to accept, her expression carefully controlled, but her eyes bright with emotion. We accept this responsibility, she said, but we want to be clear about what we're offering. We cannot perform miracles. We cannot bring back languages for which no records exist. We cannot perfectly recreate what was lost. What we can do is refuse to accept that loss is permanent. We can work with communities who want to reclaim their linguistic heritage. We can apply methods that treat languages as living things rather than historical artifacts. We can try, and sometimes that's enough. The vote to approve was nearly unanimous. Even those who had opposed the revision most strongly acknowledged that the galaxy's approach to linguistic death had been incomplete. The new division would be headquartered at Nexus Prime, but its work would reach across known space, wherever communities existed that wanted to resurrect their linguistic past. 3 months later, Jiwan stood with Velthar before the Sumerian display, now updated with accurate information and recordings of proper pronunciation. The label had been changed as well. Instead of extinct circa 100 CE, it now read, no longer a mother tongue but maintained through continuous scholarly tradition on Earth. We were so certain, Velthar said softly, his forearms folded in a gesture Jiwan now recognized as contemplation. So convinced that we understood the pattern of linguistic death, that it was uniform across all species in all circumstances. We never imagined that a species might simply refuse to let their languages die. We don't always succeed, Jiwan reminded him. Earth has lost languages too, ones we couldn't save despite our efforts. The difference is that we keep trying. We fight against the idea that cultural death is inevitable or acceptable. Sometimes we lose anyway, but we don't go quietly. Velthar turned his compound eyes toward her, and Jiwan thought she saw something like affection in that alien gaze. That is perhaps the most human thing about your species, he said. You rage against inevitability. You refuse to accept that some losses are permanent. You are stubborn in ways that seem illogical, but which sometimes allow you to achieve what logic says is impossible. Is that a compliment? Jiwan asked, smiling. I believe it is, Velthar replied, and if his species could smile, Jiwan thought he might have been doing so. A few months ago I would have called it a weakness. Now I think perhaps it is the greatest strength a species can possess. The refusal to let go, to let the past die completely, to accept that extinction is final. You humans live with ghosts, but you've learned to make those ghosts sing. They stood together in silence for a moment, surrounded by languages that were not quite dead, maintained by communities that refused to let them go, preserved by the strange stubbornness of a species that believed remembering was worth the effort, even when logic suggested otherwise. Outside the archive windows, ships from a dozen species were arriving, bringing requests for help with linguistic revivals, bringing scholars eager to learn human methods, bringing hope that what was lost might not be gone forever. The living archive was beginning its work, and while not every language could be saved, Jiwan thought at least now they would try. At least now the galaxy understood that extinct was not always the final word, that sometimes memory and determination and refusal to accept loss could bring something back from the edge of oblivion. Come on, Jiwan said, turning away from the display. We have a lot of work to do. Velthar followed, and together they walked into the future, carrying the voices of the past with them, refusing to let them fall silent.